Datsun these days is properly dead. It's died a few times, first when Nissan decided to only put the Datsun name on cars it exported in 1953, then again when it was phased out in 1986. It was resurrected as a low-cost alternative, sort of like a Japanese Dacia in 2013, and sold cars across a large part of the globe, but it died its final death in 2020, at least so far. But long before it was knocking out some pretty insignificant low-cost cars, Datsun made some of the most memorable machines in history. Cars that have found huge fan groups across Europe and the USA. So, with absolutely no prompting, we thought it time to go through the best Datsuns ever produced, in some kind of chronological order. And before we go on, if you do enjoy this video, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe to the channel to see everything we do here at Goodwood Road and Racing. The very first Datsun to take its name, following some machines that were knocked together with the name DAT on their noses, was the 1932 Type 11. Only 150 were made, but that wasn't as small a number as it would be today in the 1930s. At first look, it might seem a little familiar, and that's probably because it is. The Type 11 looked exactly like an Austin 7. In fact, it had the same dimensions and engine displacement as the car that was being built at the time in Longbridge. It might not have been a coincidence either. In 1929, an engineer from Austin had travelled to Tokyo to present a paper called The British Light Car. It is long lost, but apparently had a lot of detailed explanations and illustrations of the Austin 7 and its mechanical innards. A couple of years later, and this uncanny definitely not a replica appeared. Built under no kind of license and not approved by Austin. So not approved that Austin actually bought one and shipped it to the UK to have a look. We'll never really know why Austin decided to let the Type 11 go, but it was allowed to remain Datsun's first car, the genesis for everything that followed. Look at it! Come on, it's a mini C1 Corvette! Isn't it sweet? Sadly, that's almost all of real interest to the Fairlady Sports 1000. It had 4 seats, so immediately it wasn't a Corvette. It had a fiberglass body and the underpinnings from an Austin Cambridge, so yeah, not a Corvette. But like the Type 11, the Fairlady Sports 1000 was more important in terms of what followed than its own history. The legend is that Katsuji Kawamata, the president of Nissan at the time, took a business trip to the USA. While he was there, he decided to take in a show, as you do, and was so enchanted by it, he decided to name his next car after it. The show was My Fair Lady, and the Fairlady name would stick for generations to come. No idea if it's true, really want it to be. As for the original Sports 1000, the fiberglass version was ditched quickly in favour of a steel body, which had more power and was easier to make. It was exported to North America in 1960, but with a heady 55 horsepower it wasn't really tickling the fancy of US buyers and only about 500 were built. Nowadays, when you think of Nissan, you think of either the, K11 Micra, or sort of worthy but a little middle-of-the-road kind of crossover pretending to be an SUV. Or you could think about the Nissan Patrol, a muscular 4x4 found rivaling the Land Cruiser to this day across the world. Well, that had to start somewhere. The original Patrol was created in 1951, but it was its follow-up, the Mark II, that really deserves its place in history. It was tiny and tough, but somehow packed a 4-litre straight 6, producing 125 horsepower, and presumably a decent amount of low-down torque. It was functional, with a ladder chassis and leaf spring suspension, and was blessed with switchable 4-wheel drive. It also looked quite a lot like the Land Cruiser of the day, which was, no bad thing. And it was popular, helping to launch biggish budget assaults on the US and Australian markets. So successful that they just kept on making Mark II Patrols all the way until 1980. Long before the Mazda MX-5 took inspiration from British roadsters of the 1950s and 60s, the Fairlady Sports range was doing the same thing. This cute 2-seater roadster effectively replaced the Sports that we saw earlier, except this was a much more suitable build. Yes, underneath it was still based on a Datsun saloon of the day, in this case the Bluebird, and it still only had 85 horsepower when it first arrived, but it was already a big improvement on the original Fairlady. In the mid-1960s, the Sport was given the engines it really deserved. The 1600 arrived in 1965 to up the ante, and in 1967 in came the 2000 with 145 horsepower and a top speed of 125 miles an hour. It was significantly the fastest car that Datsun had yet made. Finally making a real sports car rather than, stretching a body over a middling British saloon, it turned out did wonders for the brand, especially in the USA. In a few years' time, that would result in something a whole lot more interesting arriving. Okay, not this. But the Silvia Coupe came first, and it is a car that you really should know about. Only 554 Silvia Coupes were made in a very limited 3-year production run. This was the car above the Fairlady in Datsun, and in this case also Nissan's range. Underneath, it had a large number of the Fairlady 1600's mechanical bits and was also largely handmade. That meant each Silvia was unique, and also meant it cost 1.2 million yen, which, when translated into around £5,000, might not seem that much, but it was very close to double the price of the next most expensive car that Nissan sold. But the reason it really gets on this list is because of its looks. There's a lot of inspiration from cars like the Lancia Fulvia or Alfa Romeo Giulia GT in here, although it was actually styled by a German. The same man who designed the stunning BMW 503, Count Albrecht Goertz. It looks like a fabulous mix between the rear half of a Mazda Cosmo and the front of a Lancia Fulvia Coupe, and we are absolutely here for that. It wasn't until 1968 that Datsun arrived in Britain and the rest of Europe. Sadly, it didn't arrive with the next Fairlady. You will have to wait a moment longer for that, I'm afraid, and it wasn't something as stunning as the Silvia. Instead, the Sunny and Bluebird were the first cars to grace our roads, and, although not quite as exciting as those other cars, the Bluebird wasn't exactly bad to look at, and was absolutely riddled with extra kit compared to the existing European rivals. But what Datsun did come up against was a resistance to buy something made outside of the United Kingdom. Sales could be described at best as marginal. In the US, buyers were far more receptive. The 510, as it was called over there, was seen as a more affordable alternative to a BMW 2002 or an Alfa Giulia, and it was pretty advanced. It had 97 horsepower from its 1.6 litre overhead cam and independent suspension all round. The Bluebird would also have a little go at motorsport. A Datsun won the 18th East African Safari Rally in 1970 and would compete in Trans Am in the US, winning its class in 1971 and 1972. And it all paved the way for the one that you're really here to see. This is the one you think of when you think of Datsuns in a good way. In a bad way, you're probably remembering Top Gear obliterating a Sunny back in the day. But back to the 240Z. This was the beginning of the Z-car legend that would spread to the likes of the 350 or the Z we have today. The first 240Z arrived just as the 1960s were dying and won instant acclaim. This was a proper halo car. Far from humdrum saloons that people would come to associate with the brand, the 240Z was a perfect mix of pretty and pretty muscular. And it wasn't just a success to the critics. Over 520,000 of them were eventually sold, a long way from Datsun struggling to shift 500 sports. Under the bonnet was a characterful 2.4 litre straight six, which produced around 150 horsepower, and that bonnet was a long, sleek one, while the interior could easily match its competitors in both style and build. It would later be followed by the 260Z and the 280Z, which both gradually removed some of the desirability from the Z cars and took their focus away from driving pleasure to being highway cruisers. But the 240Z will always be the car by which all other Datsuns are measured. Did you know that the original Skyline was not a Nissan? And no, we don't just mean that someone else made a car called the Skyline before Nissan did. The Skyline that you know and love was not originally made by Nissan. In fact, the first Skylines were from Prince, a fellow Japanese make that made cars at the higher and more sporting end of the market. In fact, there had been 2 generations of Skyline launched before Nissan bought the Prince Motor Company in 1966. In 1968, the Prince name was retired, and the Skyline would become a Datsun or a Nissan from 1968, when the 3rd generation was launched. The standard C10 Skyline still used a Prince engine, and while it looked really rather good as a saloon, it wasn't until 1971 that something to really pay attention to arrived. Internally called the Hakosuka, the GT-R was launched as a high-performance derivative of the Skyline, and it was available as both a saloon and a stunning coupe. Now blessed with a 2-litre double overhead cam engine producing a more impressive 160 horsepower, the GT-R also grew bigger arches and quad-circular rear lights that remain a signature to this day. The C10 GT-R would find its way out of Japan under a Nissan banner, but it was mostly reserved for the home market, and it wasn't until the 4th generation Skyline, the C110, that we in Europe would receive it, badged as the 240K for some reason. In 1986, the Datsun name on exports was finally retired, so every following Nissan would be sold under its original title in both Europe and the US. Datsun was gone. But in 2013, Nissan wanted to create a low-cost brand to sell cars in more emerging markets. Places like Indonesia, India, South Africa and Russia, where there were growing markets for cars but also a need for more affordable fare. The first car in this new 21st century Datsun's arsenal was the Go, a small 3-door hatch about the same size as a Fiesta. It shared a lot of components with the Nissan Micra, including a 1.2-litre engine and its interior, and if you squinted, it did look a little bit like its cousin. There were several other versions of the Go, including the Estate Go Plus and a rubber-bound faux off-roading Go Cross. And it was a great little car in many ways, shifting over 30,000 units in India alone. But there was one problem. MkII gave the car 0 stars. In fact, so badly did the Go perform in MkII's tests that the organisation wrote to Nissan and requested that either the Go was substantially re-engineered or withdrawn from sale completely. And that, in the end, was the end of Datsun. Those then are our favourite cars that ever wore the badge of Datsun, but you probably disagree. So let us know what you would have had on there in the comments below. And if you did enjoy this video, then hit that like button and subscribe to the channel and hit that bell icon to make sure you see everything from Goodwood Road and Racing.